So we see that this little bit of biblical archaeology evidence, the Cyrus cylinder, is a very important document for explaining why Cyrus allowed the Jews to go free from his perspective. Here's a little bit of the Cyrus cylinder. Here it says, he, referring to Marduk, the god of Babylon, scanned and looked through all the countries, searching for a righteous ruler to lead him, Marduk, in the New Year's procession. You see, Nabonidus, the previous king, had been out of town for 10 years and was not doing his religious duties. Anyway, he, Marduk, made him, Cyrus, set out on the road to Babylon, going at his side like a real friend, as far as Ashur and Susa, Agade, Eshnuna, the towns of Zamban, Meturnu, Dar, as well as the region of Gutian. I return to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which have been in ruins for a long time, the images which used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. And I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. Furthermore, I resettled upon the command of Marduk, the great Lord, all the gods of Sumer and Akkad, whom Nabonidus has brought to Babylon to the anger of the Lord of the gods, unharmed in their former chapels, the places which make them happy. And so here Cyrus indicates that he allowed captive peoples to go free, temples to be rebuilt, and temple treasures, particularly the idols, to be returned. Notice the similarities between the Cyrus cylinder and what Ezra says in the beginning of the book of Ezra. In Ezra, he speaks in the name of Yahweh, or the Lord. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. And you would think from that perhaps Cyrus had converted to Judaism, that he's ascribing his actions to the will of Yahweh, or the Lord. Though he does indicate that he's still a polytheist when he mentions, oh, this is the God that lives in Jerusalem, as if there are other gods in other places. Where in the Cyrus cylinder, he speaks in the name of a local god, namely Marduk, the god of Babylon, that Marduk scanned and looked through the countries, searching for a righteous ruler to lead him. And Marduk made him, Cyrus, set out on the road to Babylon, going at his side like a real friend. And so they speaks in the name of local gods in both cases, and he returned the sanctuary treasures in both cases, allowed the rebuilding of the temple in both cases, and it was his general policy. And so this begins the various returns from exile. There are actually 3 different waves of return from exile. Different people went into exile at different times. 605 BC, Daniel and his friends went into exile. And in 598, 597, King Jehoiachin and his entourage went into exile, as described in Jeremiah chapter 52. And in 586, with the destruction of Jerusalem, many, many more Jews go into exile. And Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 25 and Jeremiah chapter 29, indicated that the Babylonian exile would be 70 years. And so what Cyrus does is help fulfill prophecy by allowing Jews to return, just as Jeremiah had predicted. But they didn't all go into exile at the same time, and they don't all come back to exile in exactly the same time. And this would indicate that Jeremiah's prophecy of the 70-year Babylonian captivity is found in Jeremiah 25, 1 through 11, is an approximate number. It's in the year 539 that Cyrus conquers Babylon. His decree allowing Jews to return would be 538, presumably, not in the first month or two of the conquest, but shortly thereafter, in the first year of Cyrus. And it may have taken them a year or two to start getting organized and coming back, but it won't be exactly 70 years. 70 years seems to be an approximate number for the exile. The other way of counting it would be the destruction of the temple was 586, and as we'll see in Ezra, the rebuilding of it is completed about 516. That would be almost exactly 70 years. But anyway, it looks like it's a round number. And so this begins the first return from exile. And the first return from exile will be under a man by the name of Sheshbazzar. Ezra chapter 1, 14 through 16 says, Cyrus the king took out of the temple of Babylon, and they were delivered to one whose name was Sheshbazzar, talking about the temple treasures. Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor, and he said to him, take these vessels and put them in the temple that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its site. And then this Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundations of the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, and from that time until now it has been in building, and it is not yet finished. This first return from exile then is described in Ezra chapter 1 through 6. The date of the return is, I put down 538. That's when the decree allowing them to return was given. Although how long it took them to get organized and actually set out is unknown. It's led by Sheshbazzar, but then Zerubbabel and Joshua are also involved. The decree was issued by Cyrus that allowed as many as who wished to return and rebuild the temple, and it was partially financed by the royal treasury. And if you look at the list of exiles that return by their different households, it lists 42,360 free persons and 7,337 servants, which gives you a little less than 50,000 people that came back with this first stage of return under Sheshbazzar, Zerubbabel, and Joshua. And they will begin rebuilding the temple. Sacrifices are begun. They celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. The Samaritans, as we'll see, will cause some trouble, and the work will cease until 520, but then they are able to complete the temple building around 516. That would be the accomplishments of the first return from exile. Again, 538 or a year or two thereafter is when it begins, about 50,000, and you have the early leaders. Sheshbazzar is uncertain who he is. Is he a Jew or is he a Persian? His name is Babylonian, although Zerubbabel's is too, and he's definitely Jewish. Some suppose that this might be another name for Zerubbabel, although they seem to be distinct. But anyway, shortly after they arrive, the new governor will be Zerubbabel, and he is a man of Davidic descent, and you'll find that he's in the line of Jesus Christ, a descendant. A descendant of Jesus would be Zerubbabel. His name means seed of Babylon, which indicates he was born in Babylon. And then you have Joshua, the high priest, and two prophets are going to show up in this part of the book. The prophet Haggai and the prophet Zechariah, who wrote books by those names. Well, let's talk about the rebuilding the temple under Zerubbabel and Joshua. By the way, there's two different ways of spelling Joshua. Sometimes it's spelled with an E, and sometimes it's spelled with an O, and you can see I'm not consistent in my slides, but they're the same person. And what we'll find in Ezra chapters 3 through 6 is that the temple gets rebuilt under Zerubbabel and Joshua despite political opposition. Now, the temple had been destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians. Sheshbazzar, as we've already mentioned, began the process of rebuilding the temple by laying the foundation, Ezra chapter 1 and verse 16. But then when Zerubbabel was governor, he continued on to rebuild the altar so that they could begin offering sacrifices. But the temple proper was not yet built, and it was delayed. And even though they got back in the 530s BC, they won't actually start seriously building the temple itself until 520 under King Darius. Now, why did they delay building the temple? Well, there are at least some reasons that are likely. One, when they first got back from Babylonian exile, it would have been tough just to eke out a living and get reestablished in the land. So it's understandable that they didn't make rebuilding the temple building the first priority in the first year or two of return. But then it turns out that there was opposition by Proto-Samaritans. This opposition is described in Ezra chapter 4. Now, when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the fathers' households and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." Now, this has to do with the origin of the Samaritans. What happened was that the 10 northern tribes were exiled to Assyria after the fall of Samaria in 722 BC. And in return, they took other peoples and brought them into the territory of the northern kingdom, in the territory of Samaria. And over time, they converted into a form of Israelite religion. So they worshiped the God of Israel, even though they were not ethnically speaking Israelites, but they weren't entirely Orthodox. Which is why verse 3, that Zerubbabel, Joshua, and the rest of the heads of the fathers' houses in Israel said to them, "You have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God, but we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, king of Persia, has commanded us." But then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build, and bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And so these Proto-Samaritans, the group of people that later became Samaritans, oppose the rebuilding of the temple because Joshua and Zerubbabel did not allow them to participate, and use political measures in order to get that accomplished. And indeed, you'll have a description of they bribed the officials described in 4, 4, and 5 that we just read, and also in chapter 5, who demanded that the Jews not rebuild this building, not rebuild the temple. Well, how is it then that the temple got to be rebuilt?